The highest court in Massachusetts decided on Friday that some prisoners can be released from state jails and prisons to help prevent the spread of COVID-19. The ruling found that those awaiting trial for nonviolent offenses should get a hearing and possibly be set free. There is disagreement among some in the region about whether that ruling went too far or not far enough. Criminal defense attorney Dana Goldblatt shared her perspective on the matter with Carrie Saldo.
Well, there's sort of two parts to that. One is my reaction to the scope of who gets a presumption of release pretrial. And the other one is the decision not to address, provide any relief at all for people who are currently serving sentences. For the first part, I think it's good that the court recognized that a lot of people who are being held in jails who have not been convicted of any crime are not in any way dangerous, need to be released right away. That's important, but it's not enough because of the problem with the sentenced inmates. And also because, for the most part, people who are being charged with this very narrow category of offenses that don't have any perceived risk to the community are not generally on high bail. Most of those people are already out. So this is a very, very narrow ruling that addresses really only people where there was already sort of a miscarriage of justice in the fact that they're being held on an unaffordable bail and they're no danger to the community. There's a lot of broader ways to have done that would have provided much more sweeping relief for people who are nonviolent and who have not been found to be dangerous. There's actually a way to find people dangerous. So the relief is inadequate, and it's too few people, and it doesn't really address the problem, which is a lot of people being held on high bail who have not committed a crime.
Certainly there have been a number of district attorneys who've come out and supported what the court has found with this ruling. And one of the concerns that those district attorneys have raised is if this large number of people were released in short order, there wouldn't be enough services within a community to properly care for them or address their needs. What do you think about that position?
Well, I think it's an extraordinary indictment on government and the extent to which the criminal justice apparatus has absorbed resources that should be available in the community.
Perhaps we're talking about two different issues then. Sorry to have confused it. Wasn't there another piece that was calling for large numbers of people who are in jail and prison to be released because of the coronavirus, regardless?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, people who are being held who have been sentenced, and those are people who have been found to have been committed a crime and are being held. Yes, there was a call for release. The SJC opted not to, so that's largely moot. There's no relief. Iran released, I think, 50,000 people? Like Iran released some huge number of its prisoners to prevent to try to stem the coronavirus, but we are now officially more authoritarian than Iran because we did not do that. So that wasn't done it hasn't been done by the legislature. The legislature isn't doing it. And this was Justice Budd's opinion was the SJC's chance to do that. And they decided not to. They decided to take no action.
Given that there are prisoners who are still in the system, Sheriff Patrick Cahalan talked with New England Public Radio and told them in part that changes have been made to prevent the spread of this new coronavirus within the prison system, including reducing the number of inmates who are sharing a cell. Their spaces that could hold 12 people are holding 6, and that way they have more space. Do you think that change is adequate to keep people safe?
Well, let's just say at the Holyoke, what I think doesn't matter because I'm not an epidemiologist, and I can tell you that at the Holyoke Soldiers' Home, people were moved into rooms of 3 to 4 that they were sharing, and that was deemed to be so inadequate that the supervisor of the superintendent of that home is now on an involuntary administrative leave.
But to be clear, as I understand it, there are not cases within the prison system that we're currently talking about. Do you have a different understanding?
Oh, no, there are. The prison system has cases. Bridgewater had its first death.
No, I'm sorry, but we're talking about Hampshire County specifically that we were just speaking about.
And Hampshire County has not yet reported a case. So yeah, we haven't yet had patient zero at Hampshire County. Once we do, we can anticipate that it will go exactly the way it did at Holyoke Soldiers Home, because nothing you do after that matters that much. It's what you do before patient zero that matters in these institutional environments.
But to your point about what's being done before patient zero, Sheriff Cahalan and some other sheriffs who we've spoken with, they said they're taking those measures that CDC is recommending, that people even on the outside take precautions, keeping a distance between yourself, making sure you're washing your hands. As I understand it, when employees are entering the building, their temperatures are being taken. Visitors have not been allowed. So short of the release, which I know you've advocated for, the court system has said that they're not going to allow that. What would you suggest in terms of change being made to keep people as safe as possible within the parameters that we know exist right now?
You can't. It's like you can't negotiate with the virus. You can't say, well, we're not going to do the thing which reduces crowding enough to prevent transmission. So we're going to do something else and then maybe ask a lawyer if they think that's enough. Like either you do the social distancing properly, or you're going to have Holyoke Soldiers Home is going to reproduce in every facility, one after the other. And there's no, you can't negotiate with it. Somebody has to order these facilities to run totally differently than they're running. What the sheriff is doing, the temperature check, is meaningless. People are asymptomatic for 7 to 10 days before they and they're virally shedding that whole time before they show any symptoms. 45 to 50 staff members come and go from that facility every day. The number of visitors was negligible compared to just staff coming and going. And this belief that the virus distinguishes between staff and visitors when it's picking vectors is sort of silly. I mean, who cares if they're staff or visitors? Unless you're going to completely lock people in and have no one come or go, this is an open environment as far as the virus is concerned. Temperature checks don't matter. And 6-foot distancing in jails is a joke. Honestly, my client, some guy jumped him today, right? Just jumped on top of him. He was in his bunk. The beds are now 6 feet apart, which is fine as long as nobody gets in or out of them, right? Because if 2 people get out of the bed simultaneously, now they're 3 feet from each other. But sure, now the beds are 6 feet apart. I guess we're supposed to say that's good, but of course it's not good. The virus just waits till they're 3 feet apart again, and one of them breathes. So it doesn't matter. And then also in the jail, you can't prevent people from getting close to each other. The guards are physically hands-on. That's part of their job. The whole point is to keep people under these very tight controls, but close together. My client was jumped by another man, right? Some guy jumped on his bed and punched him in the stomach for no other reason, probably than prison is a stressful environment and that guy was feeling somewhat aggressive. It wasn't like there was a long-standing dispute. The prison has absolutely no way. The jail has absolutely no way of stopping that kind of behavior. They can punish it. They can't stop it. Keep 200 guys in rooms of 6 people or more, they're going to bump into each other. And it seems sort of silly to say, oh, well, I'm sure it's fine now because the beds are 6 feet apart, or because the sheriff has placed an order for masks, or because we check people's temperatures. I'm sure that people who are doing social distancing right now, who are in their homes and not leaving, are not inviting groups of people 6 at a time to come into their home and stand exactly 6 feet apart and breathe at them for 8 hours and then leave.
So Attorney Goldblatt,
that's not how to do that.
Attorney Goldblatt, moving forward, where would you like to see this issue go?
You need to have an order that says everyone needs their own room. The room has to have a door that closes. They have to have their own toilet, their own sink, their own. They have to be able to have food that's packaged and sent to them that hasn't been touched by other people. And of course, it's completely implausible that you'd be able to do this. So the prisons and jails are not going to be safe. And as long as we have them, this is how it's going to be. We're incubating infection and spreading it through our community. And maybe we choose to do that, right? Maybe we just choose to do that because we say it is more important to punish people who are drug addicts or people who hit each other or whatever it is. It is more important than it is to stop this infection. And that's a choice we made as a society. But I feel like we need to own that choice if we're going to make it. We can't sugarcoat it by pretending that somehow the sheriff's decision to order some masks today is going to change it.
Well, I think that there would be people who would argue from the victim's perspective that these people chose to make decisions that landed them in a position to be in jail.
Well, that's true, but they weren't sentenced to death. We agreed that they would lose some freedom. They would have to live in these unpleasant environments. we never said we were going to sentence them to death.
Attorney Goldblatt, we have to leave it there today, but I really appreciate you sharing your perspective with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.